Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, I'm very happy to welcome you to today's event addressing the trajectory for buildings, via specifically the new benchmark of 49% renewables use by 2030, alongside the framework conditions that accelerate the decarbonization of heating. This is a very timely discussion, given the need to reduce emissions by 55% until 2030, as well as to contribute to reaching climate neutrality by 2050, while ensuring that no one is left behind. So before we kick off today's discussion, I would like to take the opportunity to thank MEPs Ms. Kumpula-Natri, as well as Ms. Maria Spyraki, EP Intergroup co-chairs, for hosting today's event, as well as colleagues from Visman for kindly organizing this webinar. Prior to passing the floor to Ms. Kumpula-Natri, I would like to also let you know that today's discussion will be moderated by Mr. Frederick Simon, a journalist as well as energy and environment editor at Euractiv. At the same time, we're very interested in hearing from our audience as well. So I would like to invite participants to send us your questions during the event. For this, you can use the Q&As box of the platform, choosing the All Panelists option. And please, within your question, also make sure to note the speaker to whom your question is best addressed, so that on behalf of the Secretariat of the Intergroup, we can facilitate a fruitful discussion to follow. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Without further ado, Ms. Kumpula-Natri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to open this seminar because it's very timely. It is not only the climate change that is challenging us, it is so many legislative proposals on our tables, but also the unaccepted high energy price increase that occurred in so many member states, and Parliament had the debate on the raised energy bills on so many. And I must say, and I repeat what I said in the plenary, I'm truly sorry for those Europeans who in this coming winter and now in the fall are dependent on the fossil-based energy sources and are treated as by the global speculators, but then also the fossil prices that are not that predictable. We know that the price of the gas has raised by tenfold. We know the coal price has doubled. There is not necessarily the good resources of water everywhere. That is the case in Nordic countries. But then still we will say that there was also the increase in the price of the ETS, the carbon price, but that was a minor way. And if we listen to the plenary, I think the majority understand enough of the energy business already, knowing that we need a price signal to get us rid of this dependency on fossils and this risk of high prices, because wind, solar, not even local other renewable sources, neither maybe the emissionless nuclear, very many opinions on that. They together have seen that markets with the electricity from the various sources with less emissions do not pay even high ETS prices, but also otherwise are now have been proven these weeks also to be more stable. So the title, how to bring 49% renewables in buildings and namely in the energy, I would also like to see that in the buildings as such as a construction material, but that is not the special topic today. I think we have to fit it together with the high ambitions that it is in the Fit for 55 papers. So there we want to see the 55%, at least 55% by 2030. And when we know that the buildings are responsible for the 36% of the emissions, while space heating and warm water counts over 85% of the energy consumed there, we do have this clear in mind that we can do and deliver. I was happy to take part on the previous EBBD negotiations as a shadow rapporteur. And I also learned that not everything Parliament then wanted is in the legislation now. So there, of course, room to improve it. Happy to have the Commission here also, dear Paula Pinho from there. And then also we know that technology has even improved. The building automation control was my amendment last mandate, and it was then in the trialogues expanded that it only gets when the building is very big, but that really can cut down the energy needs of the building. And I think sometimes lobbying is very good, and one good lobbying was done to me when I was shadowing this, that they showed me the fact of the new Finnish shopping center, and it was relatively new, maybe 5 years, and then they added there the building automation control, which I thought would have been there already, and not everything was done, and it was cutting emissions almost 20% when you really pushed and did what technology made available then, and it's even improving. So the building automation control is also the word to take it more carefully. But then also I want to conclude my part just to open the floor for so many good people working on this one, that we as a politician has to see this the big picture. It is win-win-win when we do the renovations, when we get more jobs, we get better housing, better schools, better indoor climate, modern living. So the better for people, more jobs, and then cutting the emissions. So we need to do that. And when we cut the emissions, we also, the share needed is smaller, and then we can more easily reach the renewables target there as well. So good luck for the seminar. I'm very happy also this time Commission and Parliament and EU Pablo only didn't provide more legislation, but pure money. As a recovery and resilience fund is there, so that member states do have not only push and legislation on their shoulders, but resources to target, so that we are not dependent on the fossil fuels the winters to come.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kumpula-Natri, for setting the scene with regards to the context of today's discussions, but also for underlining the key opportunities, as well as the event's timely nature. So seamlessly, I would like to now transition to our next speaker, that is MEP Ms. Maria Spyraki, member of the European Parliament for EPP and co-chair of the European Parliament Intergroup, who will participate to the event by video message intervention. So thank you very much to Ms. Spyraki and her team for the great work and for being part of today's discussions via this video message intervention, which wraps up the event's opening remarks on behalf of hosting MEPs and co-chairs of the European Parliament Intergroup. So now, on behalf of the Secretariat of the Intergroup, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Frédéric Simon, who is a journalist, energy and environment editor at Euractiv, and will be moderating today's discussion. So without further ado, Frédéric, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ilias, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this meeting of the European Parliament Intergroup. Now, today's discussion on renewables in buildings comes only 3 months after the European Commission presented its proposal to revise the EU's Renewable Energy Directive as part of the Fit for 55 package of legislation. And as part of this, the Commission has proposed doubling the share of renewables across Europe to reach 40% of energy consumption by 2030, up from almost 20% currently. So we're talking about doubling the share of renewables in less than a decade. Now, to achieve this, a massive increase in renewables will be needed across all sectors of the economy, including buildings, where the Commission has set a new benchmark of 49% for renewable energy use by 2030. So how can this objective be reached? What measures need to be put in place to achieve this target? To discuss this topic today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Christoph Richman from Frontier Economics, a consultancy, René Bruel from the European Climate Foundation, Alix Chambry from Viessmann, the manufacturer of heating systems, Paolo Pino from the European Commission's Energy Directorate, and Professor Nebojša Nakicenovic from the European Commission's Group of Chief Scientific Advisors. Each will make a 10-minute presentation, and then we will move on to the Q&A session. To do that, just use the Q&A function on WebEx. Now, I think that's all for me. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Dr. Christoph Richman from Frontier Economics. Christoph Richman, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Frédéric, for the kind introduction. I hope everyone is able to see my screen. So I've been asked to speak about the topic and specifically also to consider the possible role of low carbon gases and hydrogen in the heating of buildings. I will be referring to a number of studies that we've conducted for several stakeholders. I should add a disclaimer that much of the analysis relates to Germany, but we've done similar work in other countries, and therefore we know that quite a lot of the information can be generalized to other member states. So the first point to make is that the heating sector is one of the major fields of action on the journey to a defossilized society. So to the extent that we further need to motivate our session today, that is an important point to make. The building sector here indicated in gray is a significant source of emissions, and in order to achieve our 2030 target, we need to add to the improvements in emission reduction that we've already achieved. And an important point to note here is that while we've made excellent progress, for example, in the electricity sector, where about a third now stems from renewable sources, we also need to address the transport sector and particularly the heat sector. And as Frédéric has pointed out, we need to advance quite significantly in the heat sector to achieve our renewables target also for the heat sector. So in terms of energy consumption, out of the sectors that we have in mind, the heat sector is the one really consuming most energy of all. And it is one which does not have the same level of renewable penetration yet as we, for example, have in the electricity sector. And the challenge that we have in that sector is that we're dealing with a very heterogeneous housing stock, which means there's no one-size-fits-all technical solution to achieve this move to using more renewable energies. Just to illustrate the setup that we're dealing with, in a lot of cases, the housing stock is not new. It's not easily converted, for example, to apply electric heat pumps. The housing stock, for example, in Germany, to 2/3 is made up of buildings and houses which were constructed before the first energy efficiency regulation came into force in 1977. Equally, in terms of technology, we have the huge challenge that currently 3/4 or more of the housing stock is heated with fossil fuels, mainly gas and oil. And finally, the renovation status of these dwellings is also fairly limited. So we'd say that only about 1 in 8 of the dwellings are in an ideal state, for example, to be equipped with electric heat pumps. The remainder is only part renovated or is not renovated at all. And what we need is a solution that fits for everyone, not just for new buildings with very high insulation standards. And the key challenge that we need to address is to be able to meet peak winter demand. And what that means, I'll try and illustrate with a little quantitative analysis that we've undertaken. So in the first instance, it's worthwhile just looking at what the typical demand pattern in the heating sector is. We're estimating this here based on the seasonal profile of gas consumption, where the seasonality of gas consumption is a very good indicator of the seasonality of energy demand for heating. And so you see this very pronounced profile of peaks in the winter. And these peaks in the winter, they are directly related to the outside temperatures. And if we regroup this data in a slightly different way and relate the level of demand on the left-hand axis here to temperatures, you see that there's a very clear relationship between outside temperatures and the level of energy demand for heating purposes, where the level of demand is relatively low up to an outside temperature of about 18 degrees centigrade. And then the demand rises very rapidly for colder temperatures. And it rises quite significantly, especially if we look at very cold days here, indicated maybe by days with the outside temperature of -5 degrees. And that means that in this instance for Germany, we need to be capable of supplying a peak winter demand for heating purposes of 20 gigawatts. And this is the demand we have currently served through gas alone. Add to that about 100 gigawatts of capacity need currently served from oil heating. This together adds to 330 gigawatts. And if we were to convert all of this heating, for example, to renewable electricity and even using heat pumps, we would have an additional capacity requirement in terms of electricity of 86 to 124 gigawatts. And we compare this to the existing scale of the electric system that we have in Germany, which has a peak load of about 80 gigawatts. So what we're saying is to convert all of that peak winter demand to renewable electricity, we would need to more than double the electrical system in Germany, and we'd find similar values for other member states. And that in a situation when actually we're phasing out a lot of the conventional sources of electricity and gradually replacing them by renewables. So I think this alone gives us an indication and a picture of the challenges that we have ahead of us. Now, you will know and you will have heard that obviously electric heat pumps are a sensible solution in order to relatively efficiently deal with energy demand, especially in winter. And indeed, we can project what the typical profile of the red curve of a heat pump is, given a certain profile, seasonal profile of outside temperatures, when the heat pump needs to produce whenever the temperatures are particularly low. And as we see from this indication here of a particularly cold spell in 2012, the implied demands by heat pumps ramps up quite dramatically. And so if we contrast that with the current use of energy and the current use of electricity, which we've depicted here through the year with the red area, and add on top the heating demand that we would get on top of the traditional electricity demand, you immediately see the challenge that we significantly need to scale up our electric system to be able to meet all heat demand. The challenge is that the electricity that we propose to use, renewable electricity, does not actually meet this demand profile that we need to serve in the heat market. Actually, the electricity supply profile from photovoltaics is somewhat inversely related. We produce a lot when we need relatively little for heating, and we produce almost nothing when the heating demand is greatest. And equally, wind, which is the other renewable electricity source, also does not ideally comply with the need for winter demand. So actually what we need to do is we need to produce and secure a lot of energy in those times when we have a lot of renewable available, and we need to store that energy to release it in those times when the peak winter demand is at its highest. But the challenge is that the way in which we currently store energy and the facilities that we currently have for storing energy is significantly in the form of gas storages, and only to a tiny extent in the form of electrical storage. So we have a huge challenge of storing energy that we produce, renewable energy that we produce through the year, to release it in the winter peak. And realistically, we will only be able to do that if we rely to some extent on chemical forms of energy storage, molecules, that is, forms of gas, including hydrogen. Now, just to contrast and explain that picture again, we have the option, for example, of entirely supplying our heating demand from renewable energy sources in the form of electricity. But what we need in the middle is, for purposes of winter storage, is we need to convert a significant amount of that electrical energy into molecules, for example, hydrogen, need to store it for the winter. And if we're in the electrical chain, we need to convert it back to electricity to then supply our homes. Alternatively, or complementing this system, we can have a gas-based system, which also starts with renewable electricity, converts that renewable electricity early in the process into gas, hydrogen, uses pipeline systems to store it for winter, and then supply this gas to heat our homes. Now, the electrical chain has the advantage that we can use electrical heat pumps, which on their own, and when the electricity is produced at the same time as we consume heat, has very attractive properties in terms of energy efficiency. But as soon as we need to meet this seasonal pattern of demand, we're reliant on an intermediate storage in the form of molecules, where we have not only the conversion losses to produce hydrogen, for example, but also conversion losses to convert it back into electricity. And we also need to significantly expand our electricity infrastructure, as I indicated on a previous slide. In contrast to that, complementing this system with gas-based heat generation, we have the opportunity to continue to use existing gas infrastructure and existing end applications in our home to form a system which mixes and blends electricity and gas as forms of end energy in our heating systems. And so, therefore, what we have found in our analysis and various studies is that what we really need is a mix of technologies for the transition of the heating sector, in which hydrogen can make an important contribution. So we really see 5 pillars and 5 key aspects that we need to bear in mind. We need to be aware of the heterogeneity of the heating systems. We need to understand that we're not only dealing with new and well-insulated buildings, and in this instance, supplementing the system by low-carbon gases, including hydrogen, can make a significant contribution, especially to deal with the seasonality in heat demand. And such an approach will also help us save on infrastructure, because we have the opportunity to use and repurpose existing gas infrastructure. And this model also helps us limit the requirement to build up renewable generation capacity when we know that this is a space-intensive activity, and when there's increasing competition for space for the use of renewable energies, agriculture, and other purposes. And finally, this approach allows us to limit the overall system cost that we will incur in defossilizing the heating sector. So I thank you for your attention for this quick run through, and I'm very looking forward to our discussion later on.
Thank you, Christoph Richman. And so let me turn now to our next speaker, and that is René Bruel from the European Climate Foundation. René, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Frederic, for the introduction. And so I agree with Mr. Richman very much that achieving 49% renewables in buildings requires really a step change from the current situation. Here, the total energy demand for heating and cooling in Europe has almost not gone down over the last 15 years. This is a slide from Eco Institute showing that the total demand has always been stable. That doesn't mean that individual energy demand per household hasn't gone down. It has. But also, renewable heating increased only by less than 1% per year over the same period. And as Ms. Spyraki already said, there are 2 main drivers to increase the share of renewables in buildings. First is to reduce energy demand in buildings, and second, to replace fossil fuels by renewable technologies. So let me start with the first one, energy demand reduction, which will also, by the way, help a lot towards reducing energy bills, which is very important at this stage. So here we mainly talk about existing buildings. Mr. Richman showed an overview of different building periods in the age of existing buildings. But over 85% of the building stock that we have now will still be there in 2050. So that's the main challenge. And we need a doubling until 2030. We need at least a doubling of the rate of renovation. And we need deeper renovations to reduce energy demand and reduce emissions. And I would say that we have a very good opportunity to do this via the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. In the proposal for the revision of this directive, we'll need an introduction of minimum energy performance standards for existing buildings, as well as a mortgage portfolio standard for retail banks, to bring about a real renovation wave that will improve the energetic quality of buildings and reduce energy demand. This should setting a standard and a trajectory for minimum energy performance standards until 2050, in line with climate neutrality, will really boost the renovation market and has a good chance to really get us to a doubling of renovation rate by 2030. So what does it mean in practice? So by a certain moment in time, any F or G label house will not be available, will not be able to be on the market. And a couple of years later, it would be an E label. So it's not something new. Several countries in Europe have already introduced this. The Netherlands, France, and a few more. But then let's talk about replacing fossil-based energy with renewable energy. That's the second one. And as you can see in this graph from the Odyssey project, next one, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Over 80% of energy demand for buildings is for heating. So I'll not focus on appliances or lighting, but on water and space heating. And in 2019, only about 22% of heating and cooling in buildings was coming from renewable sources. The remainder, 80% from gas, oil, and coal. And it's a very different view in different countries. And the European Commission has proposed in the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive to make the current 1.1% annual increase of renewable energy in heating and cooling in buildings mandatory. This is a first step. Until now, this 1.1% annual increase was not mandatory, but it's not enough. It's not in line with the goal to achieve a decarbonized building sector by 2050. And it would require a tripling of efforts after 2030 to keep the 2050 objective within reach. If you could go to the next slide, please. And in addition, progress in most member states is far below the current 1.1% target. As we can see in this slide from Eco Institute, this is the overall annual increase of renewable in heating and cooling between 2015 and 2019. And the red horizontal line is the 1.1% target. And you'll see that most countries do not reach the target. So this is the current situation. And before I talk about how to achieve the 49% renewables in buildings, I'd like to take a moment to consider what is renewable energy. Because at the moment, 80% of what is officially considered renewable energy for heating, so this 22%, is biomass. And that ranges from the burning of wood pellets in highly efficient stoves to burning tree logs indoors. And I think, next slide please, I think we're all familiar with the potential problems of using biomass for heating at large scale. It can cause deforestation, loss of biodiversity, air quality and health problems, and it doesn't lead to greenhouse gas emission reduction. It only does so in calculations. So how can we ensure that a target of 49% renewable heating does not lead to a dash for unsustainable biomass? I'm not saying that all biomass is unsustainable, but there is. And according to this recent paper, which you see on the right, from the Regulatory Assistance Project, in the Renewable Energy Directive, they need at a very minimum, it needs to put a cap on the use of biomass overall, but also for heating, because it doesn't make sense to solve one problem by creating a new one. And Mr. Riechmann also mentioned the greening of heating fuels, including hydrogen, and that was also a topic of this presentation. And the studies that I'm aware of show that green hydrogen will not really be available at scale by 2030, and that it will probably be needed for sectors that have no other options to decarbonize, such as heavy industry and aviation. So, but equally important is that hydrogen will probably be more costly than a heat pump, unless heavily subsidized. I think that's a serious problem. And the reason is that a heat pump delivers 6 times more heat from the same amount of electricity than a green hydrogen boiler. So logically, hydrogen will be more expensive for a household than heating with a heat pump. So the overall system costs for using hydrogen, and I'm very much aware of the balancing problem and the storage problem. I think energy demand reduction is one solution, it's not all. But I think we shouldn't only look at the system costs, but also at the consumer costs. If the next slide, please. And according to a study from the International Council on Clean Transportation, using hydrogen could be more than twice as expensive for households by 2050. This shows annualized costs of a heat pump or a hydrogen boiler by 2050. And the cost difference is really striking. And I think with the current debate on high energy prices, we have to be really cautious about proposing options that are so much more expensive than other renewable options and could even push people in energy poverty. And of course, the technology will further develop and we'll need to keep discussing, but I think we need to be cautious about this. So that would mean that we have very few scalable clean options for heating until 2030. So it's really energy demand reduction, heat pumps, including hybrid heat pumps, which have a share of gas for to deal with the peak demand, and 4th and 5th generation district heating, solar thermal, and probably geothermal. So then, how do we get to 49% renewables by 2030? If we aim to keep biomass out as much as possible, and affordability and costs, consumer costs, are an important consideration. So I have a few recommendations on that for the European level. Next slide, please. First, that we need to set a target for renewable energy in new buildings, and that has to be 100%. That's the easy part, I'd say. But also we need a target for renewable energy in existing buildings at the moment of boiler replacement or if a major renovation takes place. That cannot be 100% because not all buildings are at the moment suitable for a heat pump or geothermal, or no 4th generation district heating will be available. So I think that needs to be a lower target. And also that needs to include a cap on biomass. And that can be done via the revision of the EPBD and the Renewable Energy Directive. Then we need at least a doubling of the renovation rate to bring down energy demand. And for that, we urgently need the introduction of minimum energy performance standards for existing buildings. And in combination with generous and well-targeted technical and financial support programs. That can be done via the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And I think we need an immediate ban on fossil fuel heating subsidies, except for, as we have now, temporary compensation for low-income households. And a taxation system that does not incentivize clean heating, as is the case in some countries where the renewable energy levies are put completely on the electricity bill and not on gas or other fuels, and often biomass is exempt for any taxation. Well, it can be done via energy labeling, but also the Energy Taxation Directive and national legislation. And last but not least, at the moment, the regulation on heating boilers under eco-design and energy labeling is being revised. And I think we need to use that opportunity to set an end date for the sale of new fossil fuel heating boilers. The International Energy Agency in its Net Zero 2050 roadmap concludes that from 2025 on, no new fossil fuel heating boilers should be installed worldwide. That's a very big task, but I think it is an important, it's a very important recommendation from the International Energy Agency to consider. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, René. We can now turn to Alix Chambry from Viessmann. And let me remind the audience that you're welcome to use the Q&A panel to put your questions to the speakers. Alix Chambry, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. So I'm about to share my screen. If I can, 1 second. So I'd like to start with a quote from our CEO, Maximilian Viessmann. So for those who don't know very well, Viessmann, we're a family-owned company in heating and cooling. We also are working on ventilation, by the way. And Max Viessmann is a 4th generation CEO. And here you see that, maybe I can move this. You see that he says that we do sit at a crossroad. We have all heard about the IPCC report published in July. We are clearly in a state of emergency, yet at Viessmann, and I'm sure we share these views with René Bruel and most of the panelists, that we know that there is ample evidence that net zero is achievable and far less costly than the cost of non-action. Climate technologies are available, new ones are coming. Speed and scale is now what matters. So when we speak about speed and scale, we are speaking for the debate of today on how to move from a 20% share of renewable energy in buildings to 49 in less than 10 years. And to come back to Max Viessmann's quote, we know that the solutions do exist to meet the 49% target. We can reach it on the product side via heat pumps, via hybrid system, biomass system. I understood the point of René. It will not be the single bullet solution. Nevertheless, they are partly contributing to the objective: solar heat, condensing boiler fed by green gases, electric direct heating, especially for new build, PV and battery storage. And beside the actual products, you of course have a number of renewable energy sources to leverage. To meet the target, we can use solar, air via heat pumps, geothermal energy, green electricity, biomass, green fuel, and green gases. So how to reach the 49%? Today I focus on 3 levers. The first one is scale renewable solutions. The second one is activate prosumers. And the third one is bring people along. The first one, how to scale renewable solutions. So I start with a bit the same overview as the one shared by René Bruel. There is a massive potential for the renewable uptakes in buildings. The majority is still fed by fossil fuel. So our clear policy ask is to start by increasing the replacement rate of existing heating systems from 4% today to 6% per year, incentivize the rollout of renewable heating. We know that subsidy schemes have a massive impact on the scale of the uptake of renewable heating. And the good news is that there are studies that show that for every €1 of public money invested in subsidies in buildings, the state receives 6 to 7 euro back in revenues from taxation, from VAT. So it's clearly an investment, a public investment that pays back and accelerate the decarbonization of buildings. Another policy ask is to set green fuels target for buildings. The next lever, of course, on the acceleration side is heat pumps. So we all know that we will achieve 49% if we accelerate and scale the rollout of heat pump. Now, our goal at Viessmann is to ensure to be successful that the heat pumps do meet their promises. We are in direct contact with installers, with end users. We hear what they are saying, and we will say that a successful heat pump ramp up builds on 5 pillars. One is we have to quickly shift towards natural refrigerants, which have a very low or zero global warming potential. We have to make sure that they are low noise. It's a major problem for the end users. We have to optimize the energy performance and make sure that they actually deliver the low energy bill that they promise. And we are working on that, on the testing method, for example, with the German government, to make sure that we do optimize this energy performance. We have to work on combining heat pumps with PV and storage self-consumption solutions, and leverage the potential of heat pump for intraday demand response. The next issue for the achievement of 49% target is to leverage the potential of hydrogen for the hard-to-abate building stock. So I understand that there is concern about the availability of hydrogen. Nevertheless, we clearly know that the building stock is a hard-to-abate sector. Our colleagues from Frontier Economics have demonstrated the issues, the heterogeneity of the building stock, the issue of affordability, the energy system costs. We believe that hydrogen will be another pillar and solution to meet to increase the renewable share in buildings. On the manufacturer side, what we are doing and the priority is to synchronize the decarbonization of gas with the end-use appliance, meaning to make sure that they are able to function with a rising share of hydrogen, and by doing that we avoid the lock-in of fossil fuels. So here you see an overview of what we can do today. So the entire installed stock of space heating today can already run with 100% biomethane, with no extra investment, and they can run already with a blending of up to 10% hydrogen. And with Viessmann and the entire heating sector, we are working to ramp up the placement on the market of new installations, so that they are hydrogen ready. We call for the adoption of a mandatory eco-design target to make sure that all new space heaters are able to run with a blend of up to 20% hydrogen, and to adopt a mandatory requirement that they are 100% ready. And by doing that, we mean that they are supplied and conceptualized so that you can change the burning chamber to make them suitable for a 100% hydrogen supply. And by Viessmann, we know that the extra cost would be less than 200 euros if needed in those hydrogen valleys that do the choice to run on hydrogen 100%. What we are saying is it's a no regret to shift space heating to hydrogen readiness, because it comes at close to no cost to the end users. You would invest 200 euros for the 100% kit only in those localities or cities or regions where it's needed. And by doing that, you are ready for whatever decarbonization scenario the countries or localities choose to run. The second pillar is to activate prosumers. We believe it's high time to speak far more about prosumers. We estimate that close to 50% of people at EU level could become active prosumers. It's a no regret move to move in towards active buildings. It can maximize system efficiency, it reduces the need to fall back on fossil energy during peak times. It reduces the energy cost for occupants if we have the right energy system and pricing structure. And it enables a direct participation of people in the energy transition, which we believe is critical to increase the buy-in in the energy transition. So what we need to do is to make distributed prosumer resources more attractive and reward demand-side flexibility. And here the electricity market design legislation made some significant progress. It's high time to implement it and accelerate the profitability of demand-side flexibility. Then we need a holistic approach when we work on the EPPD, and also very important, we need to increase and train the current installer workforce to make sure that they are able to install and manage self-consumption models. A final point I would like to raise is that we need the 49% is not just about technologies, it's not just about policies, it's about people. We need to bring people along. Miss Miapetra Kumpula-Natri mentioned the rising energy bill, which is a big concern today. We still have 34 million of Europeans that live in energy poverty. The share of wallets spent on energy by low-income households has doubled in the last 20 years. So clearly, the achievement of the 49% targets need to bring people along. It has a direct impact on people's life. So what we need to do is make sure that the revenues arising for carbon pricing are directly used in the building sector when they are derived from the building sector to mitigate the increasing energy prices. So here in the legislative proposal submitted by the European Commission on the extension of the ETS, to building and transport, the Commission is proposing to adopt a similar market stability reserve for heating and transport as for the electricity, energy intensive sector. We believe it's a way to go. We also support, of course, the European Social Fund. Then another priority is to provide a flexible range of options that fit different lifestyles. So here, even though we in Viessmann, we are a market leader in heat pump and in electrified self-consumption models, we still work on the decarbonization of combustion technologies, on space heaters, because also we know from the market, from the people, that acceptance is critical, and the wider the technology options to meet the climate goal, the higher the acceptance and the buy-in of people. So it's also a dimension to have in mind. Another issue is financing instruments, of course. I mentioned the huge importance of subsidy scheme, and here with the EU Recovery Fund, the MFF and the National Recovery Fund and the low interest rate, we see a huge opportunity to design, for sustainable financing schemes. And the final solution, which is more on the companies like Viessmann, we are working a lot on deriving new business models, such as heating as a service, where we provide heating instead of hardware. And by doing that, we can avoid, people to pay the very high upfront cost of new, more complex heating systems. And we believe that this new business model, like heating as a service, is one of the solutions to scale and aggregate the rollout of new and renewable energy heating solutions. And so that will be, then I have two more outcome solutions to meet the 49% target. One is make sure to prioritize stage modernization pathways for buildings. Here we compared, it was a study led by Guidehouse on our behalf. We compared two decarbonization options for an existing buildings. One is a deep renovation at once, another is staged deep renovation, and we showed that the costs are more or less equal. So the issue that hydrogen is a caviar for people is not accurate according to our studies. Another study to add information on the affordability of green gas and hydrogen. René shared a study which showed that the cost of the energy cost of heat pumps are far lower compared to hydrogen. We do not believe about this type of studies. Probably the study that was showed by René probably did not take into account the whole energy system cost, because at the end of the day, the oversight electricity system will have to be paid by the end user. So even if you count the cost of the end user, you need to factor in energy system costs, as highlighted by Frontier Economics. And I wanted to show here a real case stories led by E.ON in the city of Essen, where they showed what are the actual, share of wallet for the household owner in two different scenarios, in the full electrification scenario and in the green fuel, green gas scenario. And you see that, the share of energy bill in the available income for homeowners is lower in a green fuel scenario compared to an electrification scenario if you factor in all the energy system costs into the picture. So again, I understand this is a new topic. This issue of peak load, seasonality of heating demand is a new topic. It deserves far more attention, far more research. And that's why I'm very grateful for the work led by Frontier Economics. And my call to every policymakers is to keep this investigation and think far more about this energy system perspective. So to conclude with these three pillars, we believe that the 49% target is achievable, and I'm looking forward to work with policymakers to make that happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alix. And so let me turn now to Paola Pino from the European Commission's Energy Directorate.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, and I hope it's working and you can hear and see me.
Yes, we can hear and see you fine. Go ahead.
Excellent, Frédéric, thank you. So I listened to already to some of you and saw that a number of elements that I will refer to have already been put on the table. The starting point is, of course, it's the Green Deal, it's the vision for climate neutrality in 2050. It's also a growth strategy. That's how we perceive the European Green Deal, which will lead us then indeed to this hopefully first climate neutral continent by 2050. Now, in order to get there, and you're all familiar, and you've mentioned it already several times, the Commission put forward a package of legal proposals back in July. It was the first part of a bigger package, which is really bringing together from a legislative point of view the instruments that we will need to deliver on reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. And there, within this package, energy efficiency, the promotion of renewable energy are absolute key drivers of these efforts. Now, the question you're asking here today in this webinar is zooming into one of the objectives, one of the targets of this package, which foresees 49% of renewables in buildings by 2030. And the question then, how can we get there? If we look at the proposals that the Commission put forward back in July, and if we look at those provisions which are addressing the decarbonization challenge of energy end use in buildings, we approached it from different angles. So it is interesting to see that you will find relevant provisions in the various pieces of proposed legislation, and this within an overall set of an overall combination of instruments, regulatory instruments, pricing mechanisms, and of course the financial means. When I'm referring to pricing mechanisms, I'm thinking of the ETS, of the extension of the ETS to transport and buildings. When I speak of other relevant regulatory instruments, I think, for instance, of the Energy Efficiency Directive, the Renewable Directive, but also, and as said, there will be more to come as part of the package, which is the directive on the energy performance of buildings, which we plan to put on the table by the end of the year. At the same time, and very relevant for the question of this webinar today, is the revision of the eco-design and the energy labeling regulations for space and water heaters, which has been mentioned here already, all of it aiming to contributing to the decarbonization goals. And of course, I also need to say a word about the energy efficiency first, which is a principle which has been recognized as a guiding principle of the EU energy policy, also in the European Green Deal. You may have seen that as recently as 2 weeks ago, the Commission has released a recommendation and very concrete guidelines on this principle in how to make it operational. Now, if we zoom into the various legal proposals, you will see, as said, that we have relevant provisions in the Renewables Directive, as well as in the upcoming EPBD revision. In the renewables, very important, a new article, mainstreaming renewable energy in buildings. There, the objective is to strengthen the key provisions so far to ensure that minimum levels of renewables are integrated in buildings in alignment with the higher renewables target for 2030, and in alliance also with a stronger renewables targets for heating and cooling and district heating and cooling. The goal of these new provisions is to ensure that renewables in buildings are enabled to gradually replace fossil fuels, since today buildings and heating and cooling in buildings, it's still pretty much predominantly fed by fossil fuels. So really it's to put in place through legislation the means which will allow renewables to gradually replace fossil fuels. We have this new indicative union target of 49% of renewables share in buildings by 2030. It is a benchmark, not a binding target, at least in the proposal as the Commission has put forward. This builds on the role that buildings have to effectively contribute to greenhouse gas reduction through increased energy efficiency and through renewable energy. This new indicative union target of 49% of renewables share in buildings is also linked to the revised definition of efficient district heating and cooling that has been proposed in the recast Energy Efficiency Directive. So you really see that you may have in different pieces of legislation provisions which will come together and will together deliver this gradual decarbonization of buildings. You also see that this EU renewables benchmark for buildings complements the strengthened renewables target for heating and cooling and district heating and cooling. Looking now into the revision of the European Performance of Buildings Directive planned for the end of this year, again, what we're looking here is to complement the proposals that we put forward in July, because those proposals will not be enough to reduce emissions from buildings at a sufficient scale with a view to the updated 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target. It is clear that with the current consumption of buildings, it still represents around 36% of greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. There is a long way to go in terms of making buildings more efficient from an energy point of view. The renovation wave strategy had already recognized that building renovations need to speed up also so as that renewables can be integrated, in particular from local sources, and promote a broader use of waste heat. So in the revision of the EPBD, we are aiming to, on the one hand, increase the rate and the depth of renovations. We know that we need to at least double the annual energy renovation rate of buildings by 2030. In order to do that, we need to have triggers so that we don't just say how a renovation is carried out, but also to really have triggers, such as saying that when you sell an apartment, when you rent it, it needs to meet certain minimum energy performance standards, and this would then trigger the need to renovate. So we need to also at the same time modernize the buildings and their systems for heating, for cooling, for ventilation, but also for charging of e-vehicles, and therefore digitalization will also play a role. So in the revision of the PBD, we will review the requirements also for new buildings, so not just try to put in place the conditions to trigger more renovation of existing buildings, but also review the requirements for new buildings and look into the long-term objective towards a net zero emission building stock. Then you may ask, okay, how do these work together? EPBD, renewables, the energy efficiency. In a nutshell, the indicative renewables benchmark in buildings, this 49% indicative benchmark, the idea is that it leaves the maximum possible flexibility for member states on how to achieve it. And then the complementarity of this provision is ensured with the Performance of Buildings Directive, since the Renewables Directive relates to the overall EU building stock and aims at making sure that sufficient renewable supplies are developed and are brought online, while the Performance of Buildings Directive addresses energy performance at building level and by the various building archetypes, with the goal to decarbonize the building stock by 2050. Finally, I also said one of the tools is, of course, the financing, and here accessible and supported by technical assistance is key to fill in the investment needs for the decarbonization of the building stock. For this, we need to increase both the volume but also the impact of the EU funding. And we have good news here. You know that we have unprecedented financial means through the multi-financial framework, the budget of the EU for the next 6 years, and out of it also the next generation EU, which foresees a recovery and resilience facility of a total of 672.5 billion euro between grants and loans. The good news, as said here, is also that we've been seeing in the draft national recovery and resilience plans that member states have put forward and that the Commission has assessed, that significant resources from this recovery and resilience facility are going into energy efficiency, and in particular into the renovation of buildings. In fact, we estimate from what we've seen so far that around 60 billion euro are foreseen within the national recovery and resilience plans to go towards construction, in particular to the renovation of buildings. And other than these, there are other sources of EU funding, from the European Fund for Strategic Investments, various project development assistance, the cohesion policy funds, technical assistance under the ELENA facility that you know well. But still we know that public funds and grants alone will not do the trick, will not be sufficient. So it's extremely important that this public money can really lever and bring in also private investment, which will be key in mobilizing the necessary investments that we need in order to make the decarbonization of buildings a reality. Not to underestimate, of course, also the need for innovation and the need for development of new technologies, which will then really allow us to meet this this broader target and vision. So, in a nutshell, the added value of the renewables building benchmark for heating and cooling is to signal the level to which renewable heating and cooling supply should be scaled up for buildings by 2030. The Performance of Buildings Directive, on the other hand, will address how to make buildings fit for renewables, as most renewables can work optimally only with high energy performance buildings. And lastly, the role of reinforced, accessible and targeted public and private funding supported by technical assistance will be key to fill in the investment needs for the decarbonization of the building stock. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paula. And so let me turn now to our last speaker, and that is Professor Nebojša Nakicenovic from the European Commission's Group of Chief Scientific Advisors. Professor Nakicenovic, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. And I would also like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation to participate in this session. I would like to present the huge challenge of achieving 49% renewables in less than 10 years in the buildings in the context of the two latest reports of the Science Advice Mechanism of the European Commission. And you see the title pages here on the first slide. On the right is the evidence review report that you can see. You can interpret as an assessment of the state of the knowledge and the way forward of how to achieve energy transition in Europe. And on the left is the scientific opinion on the policies on the way forward. Both of the reports were published at the same time in June, and they are, I would argue, both of them put people in the center of the energy transition. And this is really important in the context of buildings and settlements. And both are rooted in the European Green Deal. Next slide, please. I would first like to just illustrate to you how the Science Advice Mechanism works in the European Commission. On top, you see the group of 7 chief scientific advisors that produces the scientific opinion that I showed you on the left side of the previous slide. That is informed by the evidence review report of SAPEA. SAPEA is the Science Advice for Policy by the European Academies. And this is a consortium of 105 academies. And third is the very capable secretariat in the European Commission. These are 3 independent units, but we all work very closely together. Next slide, please. And I would like, before I go to the substance, just to show you a little bit of how that process works. On the top left, you see challenges facing the world and European community in particular. The Green Deal, for example, how to achieve 49% renewables in buildings. Then the digital age, health. I don't need to even explain why that's important in the days of the tragic pandemic that we have. Climate change and so on. So there are huge societal changes. Together with the Commission and the commissioners, a scoping paper is developed by the group of chief scientific advisors. It's a kind of a terms of reference. And based on that terms of reference, the group of advisors and SAPEA work on the evidence review report and the scientific opinion. SAPEA forms a writing team that goes through a number of consultative meetings and then produces the evidence review report. And based on that, as I said, the group of advisors produces, also goes through a number of consultative processes and produces the scientific opinion that hopefully serves to inform European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and so on. And so this is basically the process behind it. Next slide. Here you can briefly see who are the advisors. It's a group of 7 advisors right now. The next slide, please. And I would like to recognize Karina Keshitalo and Rolf Hoyer, who was the last chair, who actually carried the process of the energy transition from the beginning. I joined the group just less than a year ago. Next slide, please. And let me share with you two general comments from the scientific recommendation from the scientific opinion. The first recommendation is that Europe should design its energy policy to be clearly aimed toward achieving climate neutrality and sustainability and not leaving anybody behind. And I think that the last thing that is rooted in the Green Deal is really essential in view of the rapidly increasing energy prices we have in Europe, the fact that there are some 30 to 50 million people, almost 10% of the European population, that cannot afford to pay the energy bills. And that's, of course, compounded by the tragedy of the COVID-19 pandemic. And on the right, you see the Fit for 55 package, where the objective is to reduce carbon neutrality by the middle of the century, and others have addressed that challenge. Of course, building emissions would also have to approach zero by that time, but that also means increasing carbon price to drive the system in this direction. So that again will increase the energy prices. So not leaving anybody behind is the central objective. Our second general recommendation is that there needs to be a systemic and a holistic approach to maximize synergies, the co-benefits, if you wish, of the policies, and at the same time avoid trade-offs and barriers across technologies, regulatory and market measures, and social and behavioral changes. And the last is, of course, essential in the context of the buildings and settlements. Next slide, please. And so I come to our first recommendation, that is to develop flexible, efficient, and resilient European energy systems for delivering clean, accessible, and affordable energy services by integrating decarbonized energy sources. Pervasive electrification will be required in this digital age, but also a role of hydrogen, but the scale up will be a challenge, as other speakers have mentioned. Now, this will require energy flexible pathways and of different technologies and scales of implementation across Europe. And I want to stress that because, as you all know, energy systems in Europe are very diverse. This is a source of richness and resilience, if you wish, but as long as there is a common goal toward achieving, not leaving anybody behind and achieving net zero by the middle of the century. For that, huge investments will be required in infrastructures, technologies, from energy generation and transmission and storage. We have heard about that from other speakers, and in particular, the end-use systems. And this is where the focus on the buildings is also. And we will need support of the research innovation if Europe is going to maintain and improve its role as the leading the world in the new technologies and smart systems. Next slide, please. Let me just briefly illustrate that to you based on the REND report of the Renewable Energy Report published earlier this year. Here you see the investments in renewables. On top, the black line, they peaked in 2017. They're today about 300 billion per year. And on the right bar, you can see that Europe accounts for about close to 70 billion investments in renewables, and that the good news is that it's up from about 43 a year before that in 2019. But if you scroll all the way to the left, you can see that 10 years ago, the investment was 223 billion. So in fact, we really need to ramp up investment across the whole energy system, not just in renewables, but then renewables an important part of it. And so is the end use, where the buildings play a central role. Next slide, please. Our second recommendation is to recognize the roles of all actors and stakeholders in creating an inclusive and participatory environment that incentivizes and supports low carbon energy choices. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of that in buildings, that everybody becomes basically a prosumer. Energy efficiency will play a huge role to reduce energy end use, but it has to be done in such a way to ensure sufficient services for all. And I mentioned that at the beginning, not leaving anybody behind. we need to support participation, but also innovation of all of the actors and stakeholders from public and private sectors, all the way to individuals, so to us as individuals, households from local, national, and European, but also international level. And the third one I hold to be very important in the sense of energy poverty in Europe. The additional revenue that might be realized from auctioning tradable permits or carbon tax should be invested to support the low-income groups to have sufficient energy services, and also should be used to promote sustainable energy systems. Next slide, please. And this is essential because the potential is really huge. And I just wanted to illustrate this to you very quickly. This is a simulation of an urban settlement of 20,000 inhabitants. And on the left, you see the energy demand as 100% in case of an urban sprawl. The next bar on the right shows that the 40% reduction in end-use energy could be achieved through efficiency. And all the way on the right, the extreme case, in case of integrated policies, the demand might be only as low as 20%. I know this is a tall order, but illustrates the huge potential. And if you look at that potential, then the current 20% would suffice of renewables to provide all of the energy in the buildings. Next slide. And our third and final recommendation to achieve this kind of really high ambition level in the buildings and throughout the energy system is that we need a coordinated combination of policies, measures, and instruments, including carbon pricing as a driving force to shape an effective, consistent, and just regulatory system. So coordination and combination of regulatory measures is central. Second, to make a clear political commitment toward high carbon prices. And I mentioned the dilemma, how to achieve that without leaving anybody behind. But this is necessary because of the climate and other social and environmental costs of using fossil energy. And last is to support international efforts, perhaps decarbonization clubs, to where the Europe could, together with the other allies, nudge the rest of the world towards sustainable development. Next slide, please. This is my penultimate slide, just to illustrate you that this has been done before. It's a kind of an optimistic note. On the left, you see a house from the Czech Republic from over 10 years ago that was reconstructed, and on the right, the energy demand was reduced by 90%, and I would argue the house looks also much better. So by doing the retrofitting of the old housing stock in Europe, huge amount of energy reduction could be achieved. And on the right is my university building, also 7 years ago installed, that is a plus energy house, and it's in the middle of Vienna. So it just shows that we can do that also in the urban settings and also in the settings of the urban sprawl. Let me conclude my few comments by the last slide that relates directly. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, is directly related to the decarbonization of the building sector. So I think we all agree that better and more efficient buildings not only reduce energy demand and emissions, but they also improve the quality of life and benefit both society and the economy. So that is essential. So there is a large scope for integration of different energy technologies in the sector, but it all requires considering buildings as a complete systems. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of viewing the integrated perspective on systems. Building regulation can, however, be a challenge if they're centered only for efficiency in that sense, because off-grid solutions like the university building that I've shown you can lead to energy plus buildings, so they actually do not require energy but produce energy. And then beyond buildings, cities and urban planning are powerful levers for the energy transition, but only a few European countries at this time have integration between energy and spatial planning policies at local government levels. So I would like to stop here. Next slide just gives my email address in case there are some questions. I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Neboisa. And so now we can turn to the questions. We have a few coming from the audience. And actually, the first two questions are really on the same topic, which is about the future readiness of buildings to cope with increasing electrification, whether for heat pumps or solar systems. So how can we do that, prepare the buildings for to anticipate the integration of these new sources for heating and for electricity? One of the people in the audience is suggesting, for example, a minimum quality for electrical installation that could be included into the minimum energy performance standards of buildings. So that question was directed, in fact, to René Bruel. So, René, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think that for new buildings, it's quite simple. There, you just have to make sure that they're very highly efficient and that the remaining energy demand is provided by only renewable energy, regardless of what renewable energy will be. For existing buildings, it will be more complex, and I'm not really an expert on the technical building systems, but I assume that it would be useful to have to include a requirement to have for the future readiness of say of buildings for climate neutrality. There is, I'm coming from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands has introduced a minimum insulation standard for buildings so that they are ready for fully renewable energy by 2050. And it's not mandatory, but it's an insulation standard that sets a level for with this level of insulation, the building is ready for a heat pump or generation district heating, geothermal or other low temperature heating. That could be an interesting one to introduce while keeping sufficient flexibility for member states.
Okay, thanks, René. Does anyone else want to say a word about the preparedness of buildings to take on a greater shares of electrification? Maybe Alex Chambry, you would like to say a few words on this? Could the EPBD, for example, include some standards about this? Would that make sense to you?
So I can share a few thoughts. So first, the EPBD, what we can do and what we cannot do, right? So at the EU level, we cannot, for example, have a mandatory electrification requirement, because this would be against the treaties on the EU Energy Union that member states are allowed to decide on the energy mix. So we cannot, per EU legislation, via eco-design or EPBD, ban an energy carrier because it infringed the subsidiarity principle. What we can do, however, is make the frame to incentivize the demand for electrification or other low carbon solutions and make it transparent and good quality. So what we are doing at Viessmann, for example, we have developed a concrete concept to enlarge the current energy label to a self-consumption model. Right? Because today the energy label will give you, if you are a consumer, you want to buy a space heater, you are looking at the options. Do I buy a heat pump? Do I buy a gas boiler? What are the options? Today, the system does not allow to tell you how much more efficient would be a self-consumption model, meaning the combination of a heat pump with a PV and energy storage, despite the huge benefit for the end user and the energy system. So we have made a suggestion to the European Commission to enlarge the label to these new future-proof solutions. And by doing that, of course, you have behind a certain measurement method that allow to demonstrate the actual performance of the system. So that is one way. Another is I understand the problem, the concern of the person is more about the quality of electrical installation. To ensure a high quality, we need a massive offensive to train and upskill, the labor market, the labor force, installers, make sure they are all able to install this very complex electrification self-consumption model. And this is clearly a priority that cannot be achieved simply by law, but by working on the upskilling of the labor force.
Thank you, Alix. Maybe from Paola Pino, a brief word about the preparedness of buildings for greater electrification and whether standards there are required. Is there something like this in the Fit for 55 package?
Thank you, Frederic. Yes, I didn't elaborate much on some of it, and in particular not on the upcoming EPBD revision, where indeed we are looking into minimum energy performance standards, which would be linked or targeting in particular the worst performing buildings. So that's one tool that we can have, and that where we already see some positive and successful experience in some member states who have introduce such minimum energy performance standards. We're also looking at the energy performance certification schemes and at how we could improve them so that more information can be included in this schemes. For instance, when it comes to the percentage of energy which comes from renewable sources in the total energy consumption of the building, the energy carrier used for heating. So these are elements that are being seriously considered for the revision of the European Performance of Buildings Directive. I have mentioned the revision of the eco-design, and in particular the revision of eco-design for space and water heaters, where we're also looking very, very concretely into the product and how that can help the decarbonization of buildings. And then just a word of support to what Alex just said in terms of the importance of upskilling the workers. We need qualified workers, we need expertise also in the market. We need to train people who will be able to install, to maintain this equipment, which is different from installing a gas boiler. And we see that this is still one of the barriers, a non-economic barrier and non-legal barrier. So not everything can be tackled through legislation, and not everything can be tackled through financing means. It's also a question really of technical expertise. And here really we also turn to the industry, to the companies, to also work on this, on the building of specialized workers who will be able to actually put into place such equipment, and which will allow for the decarbonization of buildings in their own competence.
Thanks, Paola. And so there's another question coming from the audience about the eco-design standards that you mentioned just earlier, Paola. So we have a question from Robert Hodgson from ENS. He's asking how the discussions are going in the consultation forum. And he's asking also specifically, essentially, why hasn't the Commission proposed to introduce a ban on the sale of fossil gas boilers? He says there's been a tremendous success in the past about efficiency standards. So why haven't you put forward something like this also for heating systems?
Thank you for that question. And of course, it touches upon a difficult one, right? And we need to see, yes, in terms of Green Deal, you would believe that it is logic to ban fossil gas boilers. Now, we also need to look into where the different member states stand in terms of decarbonization, and to really see what is the role that gas boilers in this case still play in several member states, whereas others are much more advanced. So if you look at the different financing regulatory instruments, from taxonomy, from what are the conditions under the Recovery and Resilience Facility to benefit from funding, you will see that the level of stringiness is evolving really in order to make sure that we gradually phase out gas boilers, but we do understand that this could not occur overnight with a ban. So basically the idea is to gradually allow for the phase out, to only put public money where indeed we can ensure efficient and sustainable heating, but not to go for the radical solution, which would be to simply ban a technology where we see is still very widely spread, and it's still a reality in many homes.
Okay, thanks. Alex Chambry, maybe you want to say a word about
Yes.
because I mean, we heard the argument earlier on from Christoph Richman about the need to have the twin or hybrid solutions. This is something that you also put forward. So what are your thoughts?
Yes, so thank you, Frédéric. So first on the specific question of eco-design, again, the European Commission cannot phase out gas in heating via EU law. It's as simple as that. It's against the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, because it infringes into the freedom of member states to decide on their energy mix. So that's the story here ends. Now, on the role of gas in heating, what the European Commission can do via eco-design is to make sure that space heaters are fit for the decarbonization of green gases. So the question is not the phase out of a gas boiler, but the phase down, because we know that the heat pumps will grow. We know that we will gradually electrify more and more the buildings. So we know indeed that the heating demand for gas will reduce. Nevertheless, the studies and issues like demonstrated by Frontier Economics clearly show that we need a small share of gas in heating to optimize the energy system. So the question for me is not if we need gas in heating, but how much? That's a real question. And another question is how do we make sure that the oil and gas boilers, but mainly gas boilers, are fit for these new gas blends? So biomethane and hydrogen, to avoid that there is no lock-in of fossil fuel. So again, there is nothing like fossil fuel boilers. It doesn't exist. Gas boilers can function on green gases. The issue is the availability of green gases and to make sure that they are able to accommodate this changing gas mix. And that's why in the eco-design proposal, which was discussed in September, the European Commission proposed to adopt a mandatory requirement on H220 readiness and a voluntary label for 100 hydrogen readiness. So what we are saying in the industry is full speed ahead on the 120 readiness requirement, and be even more ambitious on the 100 requirement. Instead of a voluntary label, make it mandatory at EU level. By doing that, you secure that your heating installations can do the shift when green gas are available, because we know that they stay on average on stock for 20 years. So we need to anticipate the changing gas mix in the future. But I'm sure our colleagues from Frontier Economics will want to comment.
Yes, very briefly, Christoph Richman, and then I'm afraid we'll have to soon wrap the discussion. Christoph Richman?
Yes, just to pick up very briefly, and also the intervention by Paul Opinion. Indeed, I would also hesitate and warn to forbid or interject with specific technologies, especially when we know that gas boilers, if fueled by green gases, actually become part of the solution. They're not the problem. So why would we rule out a technology that can be part of the solution? Entirely there with Alex, that we should really leave it to individuals to decide, and partly also to the market to decide. The energy transition is going to be costly, I think, as we all learned, and by limiting options, we run the risk of making it even more expensive if there are solutions that possibly help us to contain the cost. So also, I'm very hesitant about any instruction or any way of forbidding certain technologies.
Okay, very quickly, René Bruel, on the same topic, you wanted to intervene. Go ahead.
Thank you. Just very quickly, indeed, under eco-design, indeed, you cannot ban a certain appliance, but the eco-design sets efficiency standards for products, and you can set efficiency standards for heating appliances that would increase the efficiency over time. And as we all know, heat pumps, fifth generation district heating has a very high efficiency. So in the end, that can very well work. And we'll probably need a transition path, which includes a share of hybrid heat pumps. So to deal with peak demand and make the transition affordable, we probably need a lot of different solutions. But I would really like to refer back to the International Energy Agency's Net Zero 2050 roadmap, where they clearly said that to reach the Paris Agreement target, we have to stop installing new fossil fuel heating boilers from 2025 on. I think that we really need to find a solution, because I think that's really a very important wake-up call. And happy to continue the discussion on that. But yeah, let's not forget what the IEA said here.
Thanks, René Bruel. And indeed, the IEA set the bar very high there, probably. Thanks, everyone. I'm afraid we'll have to close the discussion here. But before we close, I would ask each one of you to very briefly, in 1 or 2 sentences maximum, to very briefly summarize what your main message should be for the audience today. And so let me start with Christoph Rischmann from Frontier Economics.
Yes, thank you, Frederick. So my clear verdict is that when we discuss these issues, we do need to look at them from a system perspective, not just from the perspective of how one individual component in the heat supply chain performs. There's no doubt that under very favorable conditions, electric heat pumps work very well if electricity is produced at that very moment when the heat pump is in operation. The reality is that we don't have that perfect coincidence of producing electricity when we need heat. And so we do need to look at this from a system perspective. And the result is that we need a mix of technologies. Very clearly, electric heat pumps have an important and a growing role, but we cannot give up on other technologies entirely. And we need to think about enabling these other technologies so that they can also make a green transition. I've mentioned green hydrogen as an example, and one that is, I think, supported by many other people who look at this in the same and in the same systemic way.
Thank you, René Bruel. Your own very quick concluding thoughts.
Okay, thank you. So I would say that whatever scenario for heat decarbonization in the building sector and increasing renewables we choose, it requires very significant energy demand reduction. to reduce energy costs and to make the transition affordable and doable. I think that is a major one. And second, I would really like to ask to keep the 2050 goal of climate neutrality into view when assessing any heat decarbonization options. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Chambry now from Wiesmann for your concluding thoughts.
Thank you, Frédéric. So what we would say, our first comment would be that 49% in buildings is achievable. Absolutely. So solutions are there, the decarbonized energy carriers are there, we can make it. My second call would be watch peak loads. I think this will be the debate of the decade, the blind spot of the decarbonization of heating in buildings that requires far more investigation. We really have to consider how to meet the seasonality of heating demand at least cost possible. There have been far too little research on that. And therefore I thank Frontier Economics and I call scientists, policymakers, manufacturers like us to keep the work here. And we are with EHI planning to do another study to add more facts on this blind spot of heating in buildings. And finally, I would say that we can meet the 49% by scaling renewable energy, by activating prosumers, and by bringing people on board. And we bring people on board by offering a wide range of decarbonized options and by securing that the energy transition remain affordable. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So now Paolo Pino from the European Commission for your concluding thoughts.
Look at reducing the energy demand. The energy efficiency will then come together with the renewables to decarbonize. So it's both reducing energy demand, making energy consumption more efficient, and then decarbonizing through more renewables. We need a combination of tools which are regulatory, where we need to set the signals, which will then really send a message also to the market and to investors. These tools are set legislation, are financing tools, the combination of public funds with private funds. We need the technical assistance to also make it happen. And in terms of technologies, clearly no silver bullet. Indeed, we do need a mix of technologies, and each will play its role depending on national specificities, on where we are in the transition. So we do see a role for a mix. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Nebojša Nakičenović for your concluding thoughts.
Thank you very much. I would also argue, based on evidence, that 49% is reachable in less than 10 years. So it's 55% reduction of emissions and what I call carbon law reduction by half every decade toward net zero. But it will require really ambitious, heavy lifting. And this is why I think the only way forward is the integrated policies, not single solutions, but integrated holistic solutions. And would like to stress the need to incentivize behavioral change. A zero energy house is not very useful if in the winter windows and doors are open. So we need people, we need to educate not just the workers, but we also need to educate all of ourselves on how to achieve these ambitious goals. My last comment would be that the carbon price will be required for achieving these goals, but almost all of the measures we discussed are regressive. This is why it's essential to protect those who already cannot afford to pay for energy today and will probably have difficulties paying in the future. So we need mechanisms to protect those who are excluded.
Thanks, Professor Nakičenović. I think we can now wrap this conference. So allow me to thank our speakers for joining us today and also our audience, of course, for tuning in and participating with some challenging questions. And Before we close, let me pass the floor to the Intergroup Secretariat for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Frederick, for moderating today's discussion in such an interactive and stimulating manner. Of course, big thanks to our excellent set of speakers for today's event. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank hosting MEPs, Ms. Miapetra Kumpula-Natri and Ms. Maria Spyraki, for kindly hosting today's webinar, but also to the viewers of this event for their active engagement with regards to addressing renewables in buildings and the acceleration of heating decarbonization. I just see a question that we received in the Q&A box with reference to the slides. So indeed, we will make those available in the relevant section of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup, and that would be under ebcd.org/intergroup. So then coming back with regards to content, well, as underlined today, it is crucial to reduce the building sector's contribution towards global energy consumption. And as highlighted by the EP Intergroup co-chairs, it's additionally a great opportunity for the EU to take the lead towards becoming the first climate neutral continent by 2050. In order to achieve that, of course, we need to proceed with the implementation of energy efficiency measures. And towards this direction, we've heard a lot about the use of new technology, which is also key in order to achieve energy savings. At the same time, it's of course additionally important to offset the remaining building energy needs through the use of renewable energy systems, as we've heard by various speakers earlier this afternoon. So wrapping up today's discussions, please allow me to once again thank you all for being part of this event, as I'm equally looking forward to continuing the debate in the future. So until then, stay safe and see you next time. Thank you very much.